we concentrated in our time of song and worship on God's love for us. And throughout this relationship series, we've been growing in our direction of our communion with God, communion with others. It's one of our 4 directions of growth, and the basis of that growth is the knowledge and the firm belief that we are dearly loved by God. That's how we start. That's how we start any sort of real love relationship, is that we're able to love because God loves us. We're able to give because we are full of the love of God. And we are able to be reconciled in conflict because we have been reconciled to God. And so today, as we enter into, we're talking about marriage, and we're talking about conflict in marriage. We come from that context that God has loved us, that we don't have to get all the love that we need from one person, our spouse, or we don't have to, because we have been reconciled and we have been forgiven, we can be gracious because we have been the recipients of grace. One of the first conflicts I remember Liz and I having was while we were registering, before we were married, registering for our wedding registry, and we were going around, I don't remember what department store we were registering at, but we went to this department store and we were scanning things, and Liz was wanting me to help her pick out silverware. And she would show me the silverware, and I'd go, okay. And then she'd show me another set of silverware, and I'd go, I don't like that one. And she'd show me another one, and I'd go, okay. And inside, she was just getting super frustrated. Now, I can be hard to live with. I understand this, and she was learning this for the first time at this point, I guess. And but some guys, they want to give that whole thing to their wives. They don't care. I'm not quite that way. I have opinions, but I more know what I hate than know what I like. You know, if I hate it, I don't want it. But if it's fine, it's fine. And I'm not going to get any more excited than that's fine about silverware. I just wasn't. But she was getting frustrated because she was expecting me at some point to see a set of silverware and go, that's the one. That's the one we want. I want to be holding that spoon while we're married. And a couple days later, she was frustrated with me, and she tells me, if you don't want to do this, don't do it. I don't remember what exactly she said to me, but we had to get through this, and I had to communicate to her that truth, that I'm not going to get excited about silverware, that all I want is a little veto power. I didn't want silverware that was a flower or something. I don't know. I didn't want that kind, but there was certain I didn't want. And I exercised that veto power one day when she came home with a bed quilt that I hated. You know, a year or two later, I said, that's going to have to go back. I don't like that one. But the line between communication and conflict can be thin. Whether we're communicating or we're in conflict. You know, there's a time where you're talking and your kids are looking at you and you go, Mommy and Daddy are just talking. We're just talking. We're not fighting. Bad communication leads to conflict. But the problem is the only way out of conflict is usually good communication. And so if you weren't here last week to hear about good communication, you probably need to go back and read that and listen to that message if you haven't. But one thing that I always tell couples, engaged couples, is that conflict is inevitable. It's part of being close. We've said this before. Part of being close is coming into conflict with somebody. The Bible teaches us what causes conflict and as well as how to work through it. And today our primary passage today is going to be in James chapter 3. We're going to start with verse 13 and we're going to venture a little bit into chapter 4. And we're going to frame it this way. We're going to look at the foundation for resolving conflict well, the process for resolving conflict well, and then the follow-through. Now, of course, not all of you are married, and so, but again, conflict is part of being close. Any close relationship that you have, you're going to have conflict. And so you can learn from what we're talking about here and apply it to other close relationships in your life. And the foundation for good conflict resolution is respect. The foundation is respect. It's amazing how it happens. Your wife, that you thought of as beautiful and fun and the woman of your dreams, eventually you're tempted to think of her as an emotional, irrational mess. That man, that husband, that was your knight, the one that's going to make your dreams come true, the voice says, he's a big, dumb animal or an overgrown child. You lose respect if you're not careful. How does that happen? Well, because the shine wears off, disillusionment sets in, and you begin to look at that person and say, I know better than that person does. I know better than him. I know better than her. James 3:13 says this, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by his deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. James is speaking to those who are wise. And that point where you start thinking, I know better than her or I know better than him, is when you start to become wise in your own eyes. And those who James is speaking to are those who are putting themselves above others, who are envious, who are self-seeking. And this happens in marriage. You see all the flaws of your spouse because eventually they all come out. You see the ways that your needs aren't being met. You had expectations that marriage would solve all these different issues in your heart and in your life and in your emotional well-being, or you had some problems that you never had before you got married. And your needs aren't being met. And you look at what he or she seems to be getting away with that you don't get to get away with. And you start going after your needs selfishly on your own. Or you start looking down on them and get frustrated with them. But James is saying that instead, truly wise people act with humility. Look at verse 14 again. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambitions, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Show your good life by the deeds that come in the humility that comes from wisdom. And humility in marriage is expressed in honor. And honor is foundational to love. Honor is foundational to love. In the book Sacred Marriage, Gary Thomas writes, we are obsessed with being respected, but rarely consider our own obligation to respect others. And in marriage, we are called to honor someone even when we know only too well their deepest character flaws. We are called to stretch ourselves, to find out how we can learn to respect this person with whom we've become so familiar. Ephesians 5:33 says, however, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. This is a command. It's not something that your spouse must earn. A lot of times we say, well, they've lost my respect and they've got to earn it back. But you owe it to your spouse to respect him or her. They're God's precious child. This same book, Sacred Marriage, says, I like this. We talk about God as Father. We sung about God as Father today, but sometimes we need to think of God as father-in-law. What would he think about the way you're treating his son or daughter? And so we need to think about honoring your spouse. You need to think about honoring your wife and give that to them even when they don't deserve it. So be honoring in your thoughts and especially your words about your spouse. James 4:11 and 12 says this. Now, I've changed a couple of words, and I think because just to make a point about marriage, brothers, do not slander your wife. Anyone who speaks against her husband or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're keeping it. You're not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your spouse? Your place in your relationship with your spouse is not to sit in judgment on your wife or your husband. Your place is to honor your wife or your husband. And honor requires understanding. He says, who is wise and understanding? The one who takes time to understand his wife is the one who's wise and understanding. There's lots of assumptions in marriage. A lot of times we look at your wife's life, your husband's life, and you think, I have it harder than you. I have it harder than you. Or, there's no good reason for you to feel that way. And so we need to take time to explore the seemingly inexplicable things that he or she does. Why is the house in chaos when I come home? Why are you grumpy? Why are you so cold to me right now? Ask why. Sometimes that's a scary question. But ask why. Do the work to understand rather than to respond in anger. And many times, because we have to understand in order to respect. And we have to respect in order to love. So do the work to understand. Many times, when you do understand, it still reveals weakness. Sometimes when you dig down, you find out that the reason that the house was in chaos when you came home is because your spouse was wasting time the whole time. Maybe you find out that they're grumpy because of no good reason, for real. They're just being ugly and selfish. The reason really isn't good when you understand. But even that can't lead us to disrespect and contempt. And contempt happens when you fixate on his or her weaknesses. James says, if you harbor bitter envy in your heart, don't do that. It says, and often that's what drives our conflict. We have bitter envy in our heart. You think that you're the one who's getting the raw deal here. Remember, it's not your place to judge your spouse. It's your place to love your spouse in spite of his or her weaknesses. There's a character in Proverbs. Proverbs has several different little characters that pop up in the Proverbs. There's the sluggard who's so lazy he's too lazy to even lift his hand out of his dish to eat. There's the fool won't listen to anybody. There's the mocker who tries to make a joke out of the right thing to do and mocks the good. And there's also what pops up occasionally is the quarrelsome wife. The quarrelsome wife, Proverbs says, is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. Now remember that Proverbs' audience is primarily young men, so he's going to talk about the quarrelsome wife to the young man, but it could be a quarrelsome husband too. This is somebody who's constantly criticizing. The constant drip of criticism. And the constant drip of criticism does nothing to change a heart, except it might change yours in contempt for the person that you constantly criticize. You can choose your attitude. Respect comes from gratitude. Contempt comes from missed expectations. You expected one thing, you got another. So you can choose which one you're going to obsess over. Are you going to choose to focus on thanksgiving and gratitude for all the good and the blessings of the marriage that God has given you? Or are you going to look at where they don't meet your expectations, obsess over that, and criticize and judge and drip, grow contempt in your heart and defensiveness in your spouse? We need to learn to respect, and that comes with loving with compassion like Jesus. It's easy to be compassionate with someone who's sick. You know, somebody's laying in bed, you're going to look at them, you're going to try to take care of them, they're injured. It's easy to have compassion when somebody's sick, but Jesus treated sin that way. He said, it's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. I've come to be close to sinners. And husbands especially, we are called to love like Jesus. Does your wife feel like she's married to someone like Jesus? Your spouse is God's way of growing you up to learn to have compassion on sin and weakness, because you get to know so much sin and weakness in the person that you have joined yourself with. And you see your own sin reflected back to you in the way that relationship happens because of the oneness that happens. And sometimes the contempt that you have for your spouse is really reflected contempt for yourself. But God uses marriage to help us to grow in our compassion on sin and weakness, just as Jesus has on you. When we reject contempt and choose compassion, we receive wisdom from the Lord, and it allows us to navigate conflict well when it happens. If we need that foundation of respect, or if we come into conflict with disrespect and contempt, it's going to blow up. But if we come in with respect and love and compassion, that's the foundation for things going well. So we have the foundation of respect. The process is fighting as a team. Fighting as a team. Fighting is an ugly word. Maybe you have trauma around family fighting because you experienced bad family fighting. Maybe there was abuse, physical or verbal, in your family. And so I want to be sensitive to that when I use the word fighting. Maybe you held the idea that we shouldn't fight. But I am going to use that word because, first of all, denying anger and contention doesn't make it disappear. You can pretend it's not fighting, but it's fighting. Second, there is a real battle, but it's not against each other. You are fighting together for peace. Look at verses 17 and 18. It
says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. You bring this wisdom from heaven into your conflicts. First of all, this wisdom is pure and peace-loving. And when we do that, we fight for peace, not personal victory. One important principle to approach conflict is to approach conflict as equals. Because a lot of times, marriages revert to parent-child dynamics. And there's resentment there. If you get into a situation where wife is mom, and the husband is another kid, and when there's conflict, he's in trouble, just like a kid is in trouble. That creates a dynamic that there's no real resolving conflict and peace as equals. You end up with, I'm in trouble, what's she going to do to punish me? On the other hand, there's also some dynamics in some marriages where the man is the head and he treats the wife like a foolish, emotional child, and she needs permission to even be angry or to do anything, and so he can get scolded and in trouble like a child. If you reject this parent-child dynamic and come in as equals and start changing the way that you speak, even about yourself, to try not to use this idea that I'm going to get in trouble with my wife, or he's just like a big kid, or whatever, because that creates, when you come into conflict, a dynamic that makes it very hard to work through it, because the resentment comes out. But then, if you come into it as equals, you're really able and positioned to resolve it together. And so it's important to set aside a time to talk. Don't ambush each other or explode in the moment. What I mean by ambush is, say, you're just, one of you's cooking the eggs and the other say, can we talk about this thing that's been bothering me for 3 months right now? And just, boom. Well, no, that's not a good time to talk. Or explode in the moment when something happens that is just an example of something you've been holding on to and been annoyed by for a long time. You go, blah! Now I'm going to be mad about it. I'm going to yell. I'm going to bring out 3 months, 3 years, 10 years of frustration onto you now. And it's just a little thing that day. Set aside a time to talk. The goal is peace. Not to win and not to vent, but peace. You're pure, peace-loving, gentle, submissive, full of mercy. This is where we don't fight with fire. Don't fight with fire. The word here, considerate, in the NIV that I was reading from, is the word in most of the Bible for gentle and meek. It means that you're not emotionally charged or driven. This idea of meekness is kind of even-keeled. And this means we need to be careful with our words. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. You need to talk about with each other words that inflame and escalate conflict, and resolve not to do that. In almost any marriage, inflammatory words include cursing at each other. It includes name-calling. It includes rehearsing the past that you supposedly have already dealt with. It includes ugly comparisons. You're just like your mother, or you're acting just like our 3-year-old, or whatever. Using always or never. You always are like that, or you never do this at all. Doing those things is kind of, agree that those things are out of bounds, and you can use those things to in the middle of a conflict. You say, if somebody says never, you never do that. And you say, wait a second, we agreed not to say never. You know good and well that in 1988, I did do the dishes, you know. You know, these kinds of things. And there's other things that may be specific to your relationship that are out of bounds. And you should talk about those things. What really ticks you off and makes you unable to be able to talk? The other person shouldn't do that and take it out of bounds. Submissive, it means that we're looking to look out for the other's needs or desires and not resorting to power plays. Common power plays in marriage are physical intimidation or even domination. A man stands up over a woman and you know, or something like that. Another power play is sexual manipulation, saying that you're cut off until you get better at this. Until I get my way. Merciful means that we're compassionate regarding each other's feelings and weaknesses. We take time to listen and hear. We're empathetic. And we agree to take time out if things get too emotional and giving the other person some space and then coming back and setting a time to resolve the issue. The wisdom that comes from God is also impartial and sincere. That means we fight with fairness. We're not trying to win. We're trying to contend for peace that we can both live with. That means that we come first admitting our own faults. Jesus is talking about do not judge, and we talk about don't judge your spouse. You're not sitting in judgment on your spouse, so you come admitting your own faults. Why, let them hear you take the plank out of your own eye before you look for the speck in the other one's eye. It means that you're sincere, that you don't pretend or you don't wear masks and don't pretend that things are good when they're not. There's no false peace. You know, the Bible talks about the prophets who said, peace, peace, when there was no peace. Don't do that in your marriage. If something's really not okay, don't tell them it's okay because they'll believe you. And say to them, I'm going to honor your efforts. You know, if there's an issue that you've wanted them to change in and they haven't fully gotten there, honor their efforts that you have seen. You know, if there's a conflict that you're trying to get through, but as you start to work through that conflict, acknowledge what efforts have already been made, and then acknowledge how they worked and how they haven't worked. Set aside, agree to work on new solutions, and then say, we're going to follow up on this, and I'm going to ask you in a month or some other time if things are getting better, if you feel like things are getting better. That's how we can work through conflict. And so that's the process. We have the foundation of respect, and the process is using this wisdom that comes from heaven, fighting together as a team. And then we get to the follow-through. The follow-through is forgiveness. Conflict in marriage can be over silly things like disagreeing on the silverware. It can be over mundane things like who does the housework. Or conflict in marriage can be about big things like betrayal or abandonment. In all cases, we are commanded to forgive. When Peter came to Jesus, he said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. As married couples, married people, we feel like Peter sometimes. We're like, how many times? How many times am I supposed to forgive this person? And forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. You know, we're going to have, next week's topic is going to be divorce. But forgiveness is a command. And here are 4 quick principles, all in one slide, for you for forgiveness in marriage. First Focus on your desire for love and peace. Focus on your desire for love and peace. Look, say, I want to love my spouse well. I want this to work. I want there to be peace in my marriage, so I'm going to forgive. Remember what you have been forgiven. After Jesus commanded Peter not 7 but 77 times, he told the story about the unmerciful servant who'd been forgiven $1 billion and was choking someone over to about $10,000. We need to remember what we've been forgiven. We need to look in full view of what God has forgiven us and even what our spouse has forgiven us. And that helps us to forgive. Release the debt. What that means is he or she owes you nothing. They don't have to make up for it. They don't have to fix it. You just forgive. And then the last one is restore when it's safe. What I mean by safe is that you can forgive someone without reconciling. If we talk about some things, you don't have to continually put yourself in a position for the same person to hurt you over and over and over and over again in the same way. And we talk about that and that's even true in marriage. But in the end, for most conflicts, we want to come back together, restore the relationship, and put that conflict in the past and move forward loving each other better. Today we talked about the kind of wisdom that brings peace. We don't have that kind of wisdom naturally. That's why marriage can be very hard. So we don't have that wisdom. We have the kind of wisdom that's full of envy and selfish ambition. That's the kind of wisdom we're born with and we develop over the course of our lives. But there's good news about this wisdom that comes from heaven. God is happy to give it out. James 1:5 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him." God, we come to him for wisdom, and he doesn't find fault. And he allows us to act wisely, to act generously, to live graciously, without finding fault in others. So whether you have conflict in marriage or somewhere else, during this time of invitation, let's ask him for that wisdom. Let's thank him for the meaningful relationships in our lives so that our thankfulness overcomes our disappointments, and focus on God's forgiveness so that we can be free to forgive others. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are generous with wisdom. And if we seek you and ask for that wisdom, Lord, that you can teach us to get through these hard times that we all experience in our marriages and in our other relationships. God, help us to fully look on you, to look on you and understand the forgiveness that we have in Christ, so that we can be quick to forgive much smaller things that have been done against us. God, I pray that if there's someone here today who needs to make a decision for you, I pray that they would come and receive that forgiveness. Father, I pray that if there's conflict in marriages here, that they can take time to pray together. God, I pray that you would restore and make the marriages in this fellowship vibrant, beautiful, a testimony to the greatness of Jesus Christ. That's my